Yeah, so this probably should have been better this morning, but I think, biomarkers for immunotherapy and GU malignancies there's really not a lot of new data that's clinically meaningful. So I hope this is something that would be very clinically useful as we think about sort of the next frontier for urothelial carcinoma. So really looking at urothelial carcinoma beyond platinum and PD-1 or PD-L1 blockade. So as you heard about this morning, the first-line chemotherapy for metastatic urothelial carcinoma is going to be cisplatin-based therapy. If you're cisplatin eligible, the prognosis is much worse, as you can see here with GC-MVAC, mean survival is over a year. With carboplatin-based therapy, is less than 10 months. And so as a result, secondarily, we have a lot of data with immune checkpoint inhibitors in the US. One's not enough, we need 5. So all 5 are actually approved for the treatment of metastatic urothelial carcinoma, with only pembrolizumab showing an improvement in overall survival in a phase 3 trial. So I'll be honest, I use pembrolizumab pretty much exclusively for my patients with metastatic urothelial carcinoma post-platinum. And then in terms of those platinums are cisplatin eligible, it used to be very standard to use immunotherapy, but with the press release from the FDA last year, that's really changed quite a bit. And that now we really assess, are they cisplatin eligible? If they are, we use cisplatin. If they're cisplatin ineligible, we'll either use carboplatin, or we'll decide whether or not to use PD-1 based therapy based on their PD-L1 expression. So where can we go from here? Like, what can we do beyond that? So I think some things are very intriguing. One of them is maybe doing more intense immunotherapy. So we know that PD-1 blockade alone, PD-1 blockade alone is inferior to platinum-based therapy in the metastatic setting. But we have data with Nivo-Ipi, and this is using a different schedule than we saw with the renal dosing. This is high-dose Ipi, low-dose Nivo was the most successful. And so that's led to an ongoing phase 3 trial of Ipi-Nivo versus chemotherapy plus Nivo in the metastatic setting. And this is sort of the ongoing first-line phase 3 trials that are incorporating IO for advanced disease. And it's important to understand that a lot of these trials are including cisplatin ineligible patients in the same trial, which I would argue is a bad decision because it's going to be really hard to beat cisplatin. There's close to 50% response rate. There's a tail to the curve in these patients. I've had patients get cisplatin, they're cured. I mean, there's a 10% 5-year overall survival rate with just cisplatin alone. So I think it's going to be really hard when you have cisplatin in the same group. So we'll have to see what comes out of this. But one of the trials that is read out is the GC plus bevacizumab trial. And so the idea is, well, instead of replacing platinum, can we add to it? And so this was discussed at ASCO this year, and this took patients with metastatic disease, gave them Gem-Cis or Gem-Cis plus bevacizumab. These curves are pretty much exactly the same. So the hazard ratio is statistically significant. So you can see at 0.79, and the median PFS was 7.7 versus 6.6 months. So it's statistically significant, a 0.9 month improvement in PFS, or 1.1 month improvement in PFS. But really, I think as Jonathan Rosenberg described, this is not something that's clinically significant. So adding VEGF therapy with bevacizumab did not improve PFS significantly, and it actually did nothing for overall survival. So the question would be, are there better agents to add? Sorry, this is not working there. We know that with ramucirumab in the metastatic setting after platinum, with adding to docetaxel, again, minor clinically insignificant improvement in PFS, but no improvement in overall survival. There are ongoing studies. One of the studies looked at cabozantinib plus nivolumab plus or minus ipilimumab, including those patients with urothelial, and then we have lenvatinib plus pembrolizumab, which in some early studies was very intriguing. So that's led to an ongoing phase 3 trial that's here. So there are options beyond bevacizumab combining immunotherapy with VEGF therapy. I think that'll be an interesting potential direction of urothelial carcinoma in the future. But I think one of the more intriguing things that's come out recently is targeting FGFR. And so erdafitinib was approved in the US like 3 to 4 months ago. It's really a pretty exciting event. This is one of the first targeted therapies for urothelial carcinoma. So FGFR mutations are present about 20% of urothelial carcinoma, FGFR3 being the most common, less common, FGFR1 implications, or FGFR2 or 3 fusion. So based on phase 2 data that's been in ASCO back in 2018 and published recently, erdafitinib is actually now an option for our patients. So this is an oral pan-FGFR 1 to 4 inhibitor that has been approved for urothelial carcinoma, and it really was approved based on phase 2 data. And so this was the design, and so this was patients had to have selected based on the biomarkers, so they had FGFR fusion or mutations FGFR3 on a central lab, and there's multiple different dosing schemas, but at the end of the day, the one that was sort of the most effective was this dose where they start at 8 milligrams daily, and then by 3 to 5 weeks, if the phosphate doesn't go above 5.5, then they would actually increase the dose to 9 milligrams daily. And so they end up having 99 patients enrolled at that dosing schedule. Primary endpoint is going to be overall response rate, and you can see the secondary endpoints there. So this is the baseline characteristics. So you can see median age, performance status as you'd expect. These patients were heavily treated. So, majority of the patients had over 2 lines of therapy, as you can see here, close to 40%. Majority of patients had visceral metastases. And when you look at this as well, most of these patients had either FGFR3 mutation, FGFR3 fusion. Only 6 patients actually had a fusion in FGFR2. And so even though the label is such that FGFR2 fusions are eligible, there's only 6 patients in the study. So what was the response rate overall? So pretty impressive. Response rate was 40%. Mean duration response was close to 6 months. So this was, this is a situation where if you think about patients progress after platinum, after IO, majority, if you look at the phase 3 Taxotere Pembro data, response rate of taxanes are less than 10%. So having a response rate of 40% is quite remarkable. And you see here in the waterfall plot, majority of patients had tumor shrinkage. So 76% who were treated with 8 milligram continuous dose had a reduction in the sum of the target region diameters. And you can see here, independent of the fusion or the actual point mutation. Although I will point out that those patients actually had the FGFR2 fusions didn't seem to respond. And as we sort of saw in the last thing, the median PFS is close to 6 months, and the median overall survival was actually 14 months. So you can think that's comparable to what we saw for the initial cisplatin data. So this is actually quite remarkable. I think this is a second, third, fourth line regimen that has a median overall survival of 14 months is quite remarkable. So what about exploratory analysis? So they looked at those patients who had received IO before and looked at those patients who had not responded to IO. And the patients' response to prior IO basically shows that the response to erdafitinib was 59% considered the general prior population. Although it seems like there may be the patients who did not respond may have had a slightly better response to erdafitinib in that, not responding to IO may select out, maybe that FGFR mutant patients don't respond to IO therapy. And so that's why if you look at the actual label in the US for erdafitinib, it doesn't say post-platinum and post-IO. It's for patients who progress post-platinum. So what about toxicities? I think we have to take a minute to focus on this slide in specifically. So this drug is not benign. It has different toxicities. So we're using drugs like that I've never used before when we start thinking about this. And so hyperphosphatemia is a big toxicity. And so patients on this drug often need phosphate chelators as well. And it's part of the standard management. The other really unusual side effect is this central serous retinopathy. So that tends to be reversible, but patients can just have sudden loss of vision. So monitoring for vision, educating patients. You have a change in vision, you need to stop this pill right away and get involved with ophthalmology is going to be really important. And then the other sort of less concerning but very annoying side effect patients can be skin effects, nail events, as well as here. So there's certainly very unique side effects that I personally have not had to deal with in GU oncology. They're not things that we think of with VEGF inhibitors or things like that, but it's a very active drug. There are several other drugs that are being explored in this space, building off the idea of FGFR mutations. One of the more promising ones is this Debio compound, and the Debio compound has minimal FGFR4 inhibition, And by doing so, it seems to be the best tolerated because you have less of the central serous retinopathy, and it's just a well-tolerated regimen. And so this is sort of highlighting the different studies that are ongoing using this. So there is a phase 3 trial that's looking at erdafitinib versus chemotherapy. There's another study looking at rogatinib, which is Bayer's drug, and that's based on FGFR gene overexpression by RNAscope. And then as well, there's things looking at docetaxel with an FGFR inhibitor, post-platinum, and then the Debio compound, which is in the phase 1/2. So certainly FGFR inhibitors are coming to the main front, and so I think that next generation sequencing for urothelial carcinoma is important. Where as opposed to prostate cancer, where I think a lot of the mutations tend to be acquired over time, with FGFR inhibitors, they seem to be an early event. So this is something that I will test on the very early on. So if I have a patient who got neoadjuvant chemotherapy and they have T3 disease at the time of cystectomy, I will run the next generation sequencing on their cystectomy specimen so that when they do relapse, I will know if it makes sense to use an FGFR3 inhibitor at that point in time. And there are data that maybe we can overcome the selective by adding to things. So there's data presented at ASCO this year of bofatimab, and they added that to pembrolizumab, and they stratified by their FGFR3 status. And you can see the demographics here. And overall, the response rate was 36%, and those are wild type was 33%. So they argued that this would say that, oh, this is an active combination, although I'd be a little bit hesitant to make any true comments about that. There's only 15 patients who were wild type, and pembrolizumab response rates are 20 to 30%. So I'm not clear that the FGFR inhibitor is really adding much in the way to immunotherapy. But they did seem to be, there was a response between subtypes and molecular subtypes response to combination therapy. So I think this is certainly going to be an area of interest moving forward. I think the other really exciting drug in urothelial carcinoma is enfortumab. So this is enfortumab vedotin. So enfortumab vedotin is a monoclonal antibody drug conjugate against Nectin-4. So similar linker chemo to brentuximab vedotin, which we use in Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so this is the EV201, which is a large trial of 240 patients, but they presented the data on the cohort 1, which is those who progressed on PD-L1 or PD-1 inhibitor with and platinum-based therapy. And this trial accrued very quickly in about 6 months. Patients are given enfortumab vedotin. It's a weird dosing schedule. It's given 1, 8, 15 of a 28-day cycle, so a lot of visits. And the primary endpoint was going to be overall response rate. In the phase 1 trial that they did this, they actually required screening for Nectin-4 expression, but nearly every single case was overexpressed. So for the phase 2 trial, there was no need to screen for Nectin-4. So while this is, this is a biomarker, really it's a universal biomarker, so it's not really a biomarker-directed therapy. It's just taking advantage of Nectin-4 overexpression in urothelial carcinoma. And so this response rate is quite impressive. 44% overall response rate in patients who progressed on both platinum and immunotherapy. And you can see 12% had a complete response, 32% partial response, 20% stable disease. So really only 18% had progressive disease as best response. So this is, this is like first line efficacy in the third line setting. So what about, this is the waterfall plot here, just showing very effective across the board. And really across subgroups, and specifically when you look at those patients who have liver metastases, which we know based on the Belmont criteria is really a poor prognostic factor in urothelial carcinoma, it actually seems to work quite well in those patients. So even almost better than immunotherapy. So intriguing, why is that the case? We don't really know, but something certainly needs to be looked at further. And you can see here the median duration response was 7.6 months. Again, it's in table form that overall survival was close to a year in this third line setting. What about treatment-related events? So I think, again, with any new drug, it's important to see what are the unique things. So neuropathy was the most common thing that we saw, grade 3 or 4. You see 6% had discontinuation for neuropathy, but grade 3 or 4 neuropathy was only about 2%. I will tell you that our patient had a lot of neuropathy. A lot of it was grade 1 or sometimes grade 2. With dose reductions, it was generally manageable, so down to grade 1. Rash is another unique side effect. It's an odd rash. It can be on the hands, the feet, responds to topical therapy as well as antihistamines. Bone marrow toxicity, one big issue. Hyperglycemia is something that's unusual, and this is not patients who have diabetes at baseline that get hyperglycemia. These are those sort of metabolic syndrome, those borderline blood sugars. The blood sugar may go from 90 to 120 to 150 to 180. So as opposed to when you get a million labs every day and you sort of ignore that blood sugar of 150, it's something when you start using this drug that, a change in the blood sugar should really raise some warning signs and necessary to hold the drug. No one died of hypoglycemia, but there were reports of patients being in the ICU with prolonged insulin drips. So what about other antibody drug conjugates? So we have sacituzumab govitecan, which is against TROP2. In a phase 2 study, that response rate was 31%. And the toxicity profile was just different. No neuropathy, did include diarrhea, myelosuppression. And so if you have a patient at baseline neuropathy from the cisplatin, I think this could be an intriguing option as we move forward. Other things, there's RC48, which is the antibody drug conjugate against HER2. And this is, the slide didn't get updated. And this was a patient with advanced UC who had overexpression by FISH, and the overall response rate was 51%. Most common issues were hyperesthesia, neutropenia, again, different side effects, but looking at different options. HER2 overexpression seen about 20 to 30% of urothelial carcinoma. So where does that leave us today? I think right now, as you probably heard earlier today, the standard for patients for metastatic urothelial carcinoma is going to be platinum-based chemotherapy followed by pembrolizumab. With those patients who are FGFR mutated using something like erdafitinib. If you are cisplatin eligible, PD-L1 high, or platinum eligible, we can start right with immunotherapy. I think enfortumab is probably going to be approved soon in the United States, and hopefully soon worldwide. The phase 3 trial looking at enfortumab versus chemotherapy is ongoing. It's closed in the US, given pending FDA submission, but I think it's certainly an intriguing option, and we'll sort of answer that question for sure. So overall, my take-home points, platinum-based chemotherapy remains the conventional first line for most patients. Immunotherapy is a standard second line. Erdafitinib is the first target agent approved metastatic urothelial carcinoma. It really has made it necessary to think about next generation sequencing for patients with urothelial carcinoma, which really until this approval was something we did, but was very low yield. And then I think that enfortumab vedotin is going to become a new standard of care. There's ongoing trials of enfortumab vedotin with immunotherapy, with other chemotherapies, and my guess is it's not going to remain a salvage therapy for long. VEGF therapy is being evaluated. I think bevacizumab alone isn't an option, but potentially with chemotherapy, sort of TKI-based approaches with chemotherapy or with immunotherapy, has some activity. There's a trial with cabozantinib who's progressed on immunotherapy, and anecdotally, I put 3 patients in the trial, and all 3 responded to addition of cabozantinib after progressing on pembrolizumab. So I think that this is something that continues to evolve, and I think it's just for the first time ever we're having new data, new agents for urothelial carcinoma that are really going to, I think, change the landscape of our treatment approach.